You're listening to Olivia's Book Club, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to Olivia's Book Club, and I am your host, Olivia Fierro. Thanks so much for being with us this week after a little brief hiatus, couple weeks off to get kind of refocused on all of the great books that are coming out for this fall. And I had to begin with this one. One of the Goodreads' most anticipated books for fall for very good reason. Also an October library reads selection. So this is the type of book that needs to be on the top of your TBR list, especially if you are generally a fan of historical fiction or you like kind of a retelling or a reimagining of a classic. Hester. It is phenomenal. I'm so excited to talk about it. It is the story behind the story, a look at who inspired the character of Hester Prynne in the Scarlet Letter. So joining us today to talk about how she came to rethink this story of a tragic heroine and the woman who would inspire such passionate and emotional fiction is Laurie Lico Albanese. Congratulations, Laurie, on just a phenomenal book. I mean, the story focusing on our Scottish seamstress named Isobel and her journey to America and land of opportunity, which also happens to be Salem, Massachusetts, in a pretty tough time of our history. So, I mean, this is the kind of book that is just historical fiction to me. I put on the top shelf of what I just bow down to in terms of creativity because of the depth of research it takes, about the creativity, and about the sort of boldness that it takes to reinvent and retell something that has been so revered. So please start at the beginning of how you came up with this concept.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Olivia, for that amazing introduction. And yeah, for this novel, I started researching historical fiction because I've been writing a lot of historical fiction before this. And I realized that America's first historical novel is The Scarlet Letter, and that Hester Prynne is our original historical feminist protagonist, our original sort of stubborn, defiant single mother, right? She is the woman who takes the Scarlet A, which is meant to be for adulteress and a badge of shame, and makes it a badge of honor. But when I looked back at the Scarlet Letter and I reread it, I realized that we don't really hear from Hester Prynne directly very much. You know, Hester is sort of filtered through our male narrator, who is kind of Nathaniel Hawthorne, because he gives that introduction where he's speaking to you directly. And I thought, well, the whole novel turns on this woman who they try to shame, and instead she takes that and makes, you know, it a story of courage and defiance. And I thought, well, we really need to hear what Hester herself has to say. You know, who was she? And then I wanted to tell this story having Hester, you know, do the speaking, do the narrating. But I realized very quickly, Olivia, that I did not want to put it in Puritan New England because it's kind of dark and gray. And, you know, Nathaniel Hawthorne already did that. I wanted to do something different. So as you just pointed out, I put it in 1829 Salem. Nathaniel Hawthorne is 25 years old. He's recently graduated from college. And along comes this very talented, sort of mysterious young seamstress, needleworker, embroiderer from Scotland, and they come together in Salem. So that's kind of the beginning.
So many things that you said is making me pick up on many of the elements that I loved so much about this wildly clever book. One of which is it is kind of the launch of a genre of fiction which I really love, which is like, you know, angsty woman fiction where you're exploring all the ways that, you know, we're battling oppression and resistance in different ways, and sexism, and just nonstop, you know, hurdles and just the road to succeed or just be left in peace is so challenging for women through the course of history, and it's no different today, certainly. So it's a story that is so relatable in this way, but then it's also, I mean, it's a very interesting way to tell this story because this whole town and this new land of opportunity for her is under this heavy veil of history, and everybody is sort of living their lives under this kind of cloak of how they've been impacted by the history of the Salem witch trials.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, I love that about the book. So Nathaniel Hawthorne's great-great-grandfather was a magistrate in the Salem witch trials, and he was one of the only ones, he was the only one who never recanted. After the trials were absolved, and even the girls who'd been the original accusers, recanted, John Hathorne, he was Hathorne then without a W, John Hathorne said, no, I think these women were witches and they deserved their fates. And so Nathaniel Hawthorne is haunted by this. He's haunted by the legacy of his great-great-grandfather, unjustly condemning women to death. And into this story comes Isobel Gamble, my heroine, and she is descended in Scotland from a woman named Isobel Gowdie, who is an apocryphal but real person called the Queen of Witches in Scotland, and she was accused of witchcraft and stood trial in Scotland around the same time as the Salem witch trials. So we have an accused, a descendant of the accused, and a descendant of the accuser, which, as you just said, is exactly what it was like living in Salem. And it continued. The people who had been accused and freed, or the children and spouses and siblings and even mothers of women who'd been killed as witches, stayed there for a variety of reasons. And that really continues to this day, that the people who were in Salem during the witch trials kind of never left and just had to contend with that guilt/shame/anger. And Olivia, as you touched on, the witch trials in Salem especially, but all around Europe as well, it was really aimed at women who were powerful or different. If they accuse you of witchcraft, they could take away your land. And so it was a land grab in many cases as well. And that's an important legacy that I really try to connect to, but, without too much of a heavy hand, because most of all, it's meant to be sort of an intriguing, enchanting tale.
Right, and enchanting definitely, because there does feel to be these woven threads of generational magic that are happening, whether it's just of strength or weakness of character based on lineage or family history, right? And so yes. Nathaniel is, of course, an artist and a storyteller, and he's got a lot of emotion, but he's like the modern day like emo guy, where he is just kind of weak and tormented and just in his head and just can't step up, and he's just like, you're like, oh God, like write it already and like be a man already, or whatever that is that means. Because in contrast, Isobel is so complex and so strong and so passionate and so gifted in so many ways, and able to be very active in her own destiny. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of not a lot of trouble. I had a lot of fun writing Hawthorne. And in the beginning, it's always really hard to write this guy who, he's kind of the bad boy that many girls are attracted to, especially, when we're teenagers, which Isobel is 19 years old. And when I was writing Nathaniel Hawthorne, my agent said, we're kind of screaming at Isobel, no, don't do it the whole time. And we don't want to do that. We want to see his allure. He needs to be a sort of Heathcliff, where he's dark and brooding, but we understand the draw, right? And so that was really fun, and I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah.
So Isobel is just incredibly compelling, and her story that brings her to the States in the first place, and the obstacles and what she's had to go through, and really, as women would have been in her day, very at the mercy of the men in her life, whether it's in terms of economics and viability to take care of themselves, and household, and from her father to a husband, and on and on. Yet she's very she's got this fiery hair, and she's got this incredible gift. So talk about her talents, and also the way that you set up this story by giving us some context that is in your prologue really fascinating. I mean, the second that I locked into this, I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. Yeah. So yes. So Isobel is gifted and she's strong. One of the things that I was really drawn to is that, like so many creative people, or people not just creatives, her gift is her curse and her curse is her gift, right? And I mean, I sort of do that a little bit with Hawthorne as well. But so for Isobel Gamble, you're referring in part to her synesthesia, right?
Yes.
So she has synesthesia, which means that in her particular case, she sees colors and shapes when people are speaking, and she also sees letters in colors. So for many people who have color synesthesia, A really is a red letter. So what happened was I came to that idea because I was rereading the Scarlet Letter over and over, and I thought, here's this woman, Hester Prynne. She has been, canceled, banished, put out to pasture. And yet all these people in Boston, that's where the story takes place, are going to her to hire her to do needlework. Every Puritan woman knew how to do needlework, knew how to do embroidery. I thought, what made her work so extraordinary? And I was like, oh, well, maybe she had synesthesia. And then I gave it to Isobel. And it was a really fun, visual, vivid thing to work with. And at that point, I realized, of course, I had to do a lot of research into synesthesia, and I found out that, yes, sometimes it is an inherited trait. And so I go back in time to this Isobel Gowdy, this woman who was accused of witchcraft in the late 1600s in Scotland, and I kind of give it to her. I give her synesthesia as well. So it is a secret that it is a trait that has been passed down through Isobel's family line, through the women, and it's also a secret that they've been keeping forever. So she has this gift, but of course in 1829 there really was no research about it, which I do say right in the little note to readers in the beginning. So she wouldn't have understood what was happening to her, and that's even true for people who have synesthesia today, from what I understand. I don't have it myself.
Well, now I wish I had it, of course, because it just sounds so fascinating.
Yeah,
right. But it was just such an interesting setup. So you're kind of it makes you kind of question everything that would be like a recounting of anybody who, is unusual in a time period, and how, you could be condemned, of course, in the most vile or dramatic of ways for being different, as we mentioned. And this is really something that is a condition, and you use the example. And I had watched that Billie Eilish, or like the painter Kandinsky. And so it's like incredible talents that's just channeled in a way that maybe other people would call even supernatural, or cultish, or witchcraft, whatever, on and on. So it just set a tone for looking at these stories and these characters and these people and the history of this backstory in such a great way. It was thrilling to read it, and I got completely lost in it. I loved it.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the synesthesia is really a fun thing, and I would like to do more with that. Maybe I'll give another, I don't know, it's kind of a one-of-a-kind thing.
Well, and so what else? I want to know a little bit about your process, because to me what just seems so I think so miraculous about historical fiction, especially when you're bold enough to take on a classic in some shape. Because you have to know so much about not only the original book, but of course the time periods that you're delving into, the migration. I mean, she goes on this journey by ship, which is, very harrowing in a lot of ways, emotionally and physically and all of it, to get to the new world. And so, I mean, when does the story start? When does the research go? How long does the research go before you sit down and start writing pen to paper, and how does that all happen?
Yeah. So if you can see these shelves behind me, they're just loaded with with research books. And I researched Salem all the way back to the original settlers, to the original Puritans, which is how I have those little, what we call interstitials, where I give you a view of John Hawthorne when he first comes to, when he's a boy in America. And I give you a look at Hawthorne's early relatives when they came here. So I had to do a lot of research into Salem and such deep research that I found out, for example, that many of the people who were in Salem actually have been given land up in Maine, and that the King Philip's Wars, what we call the Indian Wars, they were between the settlers and the Native American indigenous people who were fighting over the land. So I had to read about that. I did a lot of research into why was Salem such a wealthy city. One of the most interesting things I learned is that Salem, before the 1812 war, was home to some of the richest people in the richest men in the world. And the reason they were so rich, I found through a lot of research, some of which I had to arrive at on my own. I didn't find it in a book, but sort of pieced it together, that the reason they were so wealthy had everything to do with the slave trade. Right? Like New England was wealthy because they were shippers and they were shipping magnates and they were bringing in cod. So I had to research like the slave trade and the Middle Passage. And then I had to research witchcraft, and I had to research, accusations of witchcraft. And I had to research needlework and embroidery. So the answer to your question is a lot of research, and it's kind of ongoing. A lot of times I do reading, I'm writing from the very beginning, and then I'm realizing what I need to know. I'm going back. And I went to Salem a couple of times, and that was really fun. And I'm going to Salem again with the book, which I'm really excited about too. Yeah, so a lot of research. And, you have to be able to make your character walk down the street, get dressed. You have to know what she's going to eat, how she's going to make her money, what kind of bed, what kind of blanket, all that, lighting, all that stuff. And so that takes, and then you have to kind of layer it in as if you haven't done all that research. So hopefully it's not a heavy hand. Mm-hmm. I've just used it to tell the story of this woman.
Yeah, you're creating a world, but we're completely invested in the story and her experience. But you're creating a world that is so full of detail and depth that we're there.
Yeah, good.
Do you do any needlepoint? Does this? I mean, she is. Her gift is capturing sort of these moments and embroidering these stories and kind of keeping a living history. And there's a lot of power in the colors and words that can be hidden and symbols that can be very, very loaded with intense meaning. And so, was that something that you felt like you had to learn a little bit of, or forget that?
Well, when I was in college, I actually spent a very long time embroidering the back of my boyfriend's denim jacket with a cover, an album cover from the Grateful Dead.
Wow, that's commitment.
Like for a whole year. Yeah, he left it on the train. It was never recovered. He's in the past too. So I did. I went out and I bought some threads because I love color. And I have pictures. I did a lot of research in this book that's called Painted with Thread, and it gives you sort of the whole history of embroidery, particularly in Salem. But, I bought some kits. I have this unbelievable book here, Mystical Stitches, of all these like witches symbols.
Whoa.
Yeah, I love this. I was sent this actually since my book came, because of my book. I wish I had it at the time, but it's almost as if I had looked at this book and found these things myself. So no, I keep saying maybe I'm going to do some embroidering, but thank goodness, talking about the book is keeping me very busy.
So maybe in a past life you were like a sorceress, a seamstress, and you really have done this before.
Maybe I'm a sorceress now.
Yeah. I don't mean to make assumptions and deny what you could be. You're a multi-hyphenate. I'm sure of it. Right. So I have. This is my first time reading any of your work. So given that I'm so in love with Hester, if I'm going to dig back into your library, what is the next book that I should read of yours?
Oh, well, thank you for that. So my prior book is Stolen Beauty, and it is right behind me. You see the gold cover there. And this is a novel that looks at a famous painting by Gustav Klimt. It's called, we know it as The Woman in Gold. It was from The Lady in Gold. So it's called Stolen Beauty, and it follows this famous painting that Gustav Klimt did in 1908. I'll show you the picture of it, Olivia, and you will know it right away.
Yes.
That famous painting, that Klimt painting. So this novel looks at the creation of that painting. So it's, it's looking at the creative process between the painter and the woman. And of course, because we should never have a novel without, some sort of love interest, they have a love affair in the book. So that was a lot of fun to write. And,
wow.
I do love this book. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so that's on my list now. Before we wrap up, Laurie, will you give me a little bit of, obviously your passion for books is clear, your passion for writing. Everybody who writes, I assume, is initially a fan of reading, a reader at heart. So two things. When did you first realize that you had a special relationship with books? And, what did it mean to you, and kind of where and when? And lastly, what advice would you have for the readers out there who just love this space and dream of maybe, putting pen to paper or sitting down and figuring out whether they had a story to tell as well?
Okay. So, thank you. I love that question, always. So I started writing when I was a little girl. My mother had a dictionary that she kept by her bedside, and in the back it had rhyming words. So I used to look up the rhyming words, and I would write poetry. So I kind of knew I wanted to be a writer from a very young age. I went to school for journalism because I didn't think poetry was going to help me make a living. And the truth of the matter is that I really like doing research. And so what I do now is so far, I've looked at the lives of real people and their creative output and their creative processes, and I've kind of imagined the story behind the story. So that has been, that's something that I feel like is an extension of when we were in high school and used to write papers by doing research into the lives of the painter and then the history of the painting. So a lot of creativity is involved, you're right. For anyone who is interested in writing a novel in particular or historical fiction, first, I feel like it's really important to remember to take the mystery out of writing. Writing is a craft, and it can be learned the same way that you can learn how to cook from a recipe. I mean, I don't know if you'll be a brilliant cook if you follow the recipe, but there are a lot of things that you have to learn. You have to know how to write conversations between people. You have to know how to create a character. You have to do scene setting. And these are all tasks that can be tackled and learned. But then at a certain point, if you were going to write a novel that is about a real person, you use that story as your inspiration, as your jumping off point. And at a certain point, like you've jumped off of the dock and you're not yet in the water, and it's right there where the magic happens. I don't know if that's a helpful prescription.
And I guess it's a lot easier when those people are long gone, right? Because then at least you don't have to worry about I've reimagined this story and now they're going to sue me.
You have to find the holes in the story. I mean, like for Hester, what happened was once I knew I wanted Nathaniel Hawthorne to be a character, I started looking very deeply into his life. And it turns out that there are 10 years in his life where very little is known about him, and he destroyed his journals, and those happened to be the 10 years right out of college. So the myth was that he was spent 10 years alone in his room learning how to write. But he was a really good looking guy. He was a little bit of a troublemaker in college. And they said, the only thing he used to do is go out walking alone at night. And I was like, okay, bingo. So looking for the holes in the story, looking for where things aren't known, that's actually a gift to the writer.
Fantastic. That is a very good advice. Well, was an absolute delight to speak to you, and it is a fantastic book. I cannot recommend it enough. And they just did such a gorgeous job with this cover, because once you dig into the story, I mean, you realize this is up to Isobel's standards here, don't you think?
Yes, yes. And a little dark and a little twisted, just like the Gothic tones in the novel.
Oh, I'm looking for the hidden words here, and I'm sure I'm going to find them.
That would have been a great idea, but don't spend all day looking.
I'll end up frustrated. Okay, that's duly noted. Thank you so much. Okay, Hester, released here October 4th. And thank you so much, Laurie Lico Albanese. It was a pleasure, and congratulations.
Olivia, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Olivia's Book Club, the podcast. I'm your host, Olivia Fierro. Our producer is Margaret Stewart. You can send us an email with your thoughts or your book recommendations. Olivia's Book Club at azfamily.com is the address. And you can check out Olivia's Book Club on Facebook or find us on Instagram. Hello, Bookstagrammers, at olivias.bookclub. And Margaret is at Overbooked and Overdue. Make sure to rate and subscribe to this podcast and tell your friends. You can find us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music.
This is Olivia's Book Club, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.